I have the great honor of talking to Kim Stanley Robinson, one of my heroes, because I have been a sci-fi reader and since I can remember, since I was a kid. My mom used to give me Isaac Asimov novels when I was a kid, and Ray Bradbury, and I've read all his work, and the Mars trilogy, and when I read Ministry for the Future, it just really had a major impact on the work that I do at As You Sow, because we work on climate change all the time, working with big corporations on getting climate plans together and on climate change broadly across utilities and banks and pipelines and fracking companies. So we've been deeply involved in this, both from the engagement side and also the divest fossil fuel side. So Ministry for the Future, to me, was a book that just had a huge impact because, well, first off, it's a brilliant narrative. So it captures a lot of the emotion, but it also has a great deal of nonfiction woven into it, which give us a lot of ideas. And so I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, Stan, to the group, and then we'll start in and talk about the book. But if you could just introduce yourself, I think we got a good crowd here. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thanks everybody for checking in. I am Stan Robinson. I'm an American science fiction writer. I've lived in Davis, California for the last 30 years. I grew up in Southern California, down in Orange County near the beach. And my wife, Lisa Knoll, is a environmental chemist for the U.S. Geological Survey, so she does water chemistry and really the fate of pesticides in the landscape. So as a science fiction writer, I've had the advantage of watching a scientist at work and also her network, her agency, USGS, and other federal agencies. So the federal science level is National Science Foundation and USGS are places that I've had looks inside of. That's been a huge advantage when I do that kind of science fiction, which isn't always, but a few times in my career, and definitely in Ministry for the Future, also in the book that is now called Green Earth, a trilogy from the first part of this millennium, and in other books, New York 2140. Climate seems to have overtaken the future, so inevitably I've been writing about it more and trying to do a kind of a future realism, I guess you would call it. Academics call it proleptic realism, where although I do set stories in the future, so they necessarily fictionalized and made up, I try to make them feel realistic, like, okay, this could really happen. So I don't write fantasy, except for a couple times in my entire career. I'm focused on realistic futures. And aside from that, Ministry for the Future, I think it's worth saying a couple words about that. I learned about the wet bulb 35 temperatures, that the combination of heat and humidity, when it gets high enough, it kills humans, and you would have to be in air conditioning. And this was a finding that had kind of been lurking in the scientific literature without anybody noticing it as how dangerous it's going to be until they put it all together. And the papers began to appear around 2018, I would say. When I read them, I thought, my God, we can't adapt to 3 degrees rise, because this is what the adaptationists were saying. And this guy Nordhaus, I think, won a pseudo-Nobel in economics for saying that we just adapt and we can go high. The scientists are just, there's no upper limit to what humans can adapt to because we're so damned adaptable. And then there's this physical limit. Sorry, it actually kills us to get to these really high humid temperatures. I thought, I've got to write about that. And I had written a lot of novels that were sprawling and formally strange. And so when you decide to write about the next 30 years and the whole world, the novel isn't really well set up to do that, not the ordinary novel. But that's okay. I have had practice in the story of terraforming Mars, the story of coping with climate change and the stalling of the Gulf Stream. All kinds of peculiar assignments I've given myself. And the novel is a very capacious and flexible form. And for Ministry for the Future, what I decided was I'm going to have lots of different kinds of narratives. I'm going to have a photon talk to you, or the sun. I'm going to have riddles, ancient Anglo-Saxon games, and then also, crucially, the eyewitness account. Eyewitness accounts, there are collections of them, and they're very interesting. They really try to get people to say what they saw and did on an important day in history. Like, there's one called Spring 1945, like what was it like in Germany in Spring 1945? And they do tend to focus on times of crisis because that's when the eyewitness accounts are interesting. But it's also, what struck me is these eyewitness accounts are not fiction as a novel would typically be written, where you go into a kind of a real-time, moment-by-moment interiorized portrait of a character's day. That's a crucial mode. That's really the bedrock of fiction. But an eyewitness account says, we went down to the town square that morning and a riot was beginning, and they don't bother to dramatize that scene. There's a propulsive quality to the eyewitness account that once you use it as a tool of fiction, I found it extraordinarily powerful and stimulating to try to throw in possibly 30 or 40 fictionalized eyewitness accounts for things happening in the next 3 decades that would be interesting and crucial. So that, I think I'll pause at that so that I can shift it back over to Andrew and questions that you might have.
Well, no, that's great. And that's a great setup because the first thing I wanted to talk to you about was sort of the narrative structure and how that some novels are utopian, some are dystopian, but you've managed to thread the needle of neither. It's near term, yet you also start out with sort of specific dates, and as the novel goes forward, it loses its sense of time. It feels very chaotic, but it's a potentially probable future.
Yeah,
and that's what's really interesting because it's really draws you in because this could actually play out. And I kept thinking, and as I was actually listening to it, I admit I listened to it on Audible, which for anyone listening, it's one of the best Audibles I've ever heard because there had to be 10 voice actors playing all the parts. It was like theater. I was madly scribbling notes about what could we do? What can we learn from this novel to avoid this, some of the things in the future that you've laid out. So speak about the narrative structure and also that idea of not utopian, not dystopian, but actually could happen if we don't get our act together really soon.
Sure. And I appreciate that very much. I think of myself as a utopian science fiction writer, but in the era of climate change, you have to think hard. What would that mean? What is utopia? And I would say that the bar has been lowered such that if we get through this century without a mass extinction event and have saved the other animals and saved ourselves, that's a utopian future at this point. So the bar's been lowered. And then also, let's change the way to describe it. Not utopia, but best case scenario. So if you have a spread of possible futures, which we do, and the worst of them are quite dreadful, and the best of them are really very promising, full of potential for human and biosphere prosperity over the long haul. That kind of spread is disorienting in itself. So being a utopian science fiction writer, and I don't care for dystopias anymore. They're too easy. They're like comfort food. They don't tell us anything new. We know we're in big trouble. So best case scenario, that you can still believe in. So that brings in what I think Andrew is referring to as maybe the dystopian elements, the negative elements. A lot of bad stuff happens in that novel. So when you call it a utopian novel, it's like, well, wait, I thought utopia was the perfect place. It's not. It's the best case scenario. And to believe in it, you have to incorporate the bad that is inevitably coming along with the good. I think that the future, like the 2020s, there's going to be lots of panicky notions that we are failing, that we are not coping fast enough, that we're sliding on a slippery slope down to doom. That's going to be a constant drumbeat, even though we might be succeeding. So a mixed picture like that was what I was hoping for in this book. And as far as structure, I notice now, after the fact, that almost every time something good happens in the book, something terrible happens in the next chapter. I notice that there are three prominent deaths, one by accident, one by illness, one by murder. So these were not really conscious choices, but I did have an overriding concern with making this book feel real while you read it. And then when you get to the end of it, which is, about 30 years out, I did blur the dates on purpose. And you realize that actually they've gotten to a pretty good place relative to the other possibilities, that carbon is going down, that clean tech is there, that people haven't killed each other, et cetera, that it's actually a pretty best case scenario with a lot of bad along the way. That's the feeling that I wanted to create by the structure of it.
And I think you did. But let's talk about some of the good outcomes that actually happen. One of them is this idea of a carbon coin. And I remember well in the book that there was a farm that people were doing regenerative agriculture, and they were shocked when the carbon coin people arrived and said, actually, you're going to earn more money from your sequestration of carbon in this regenerative agriculture, where every time you harvested a crop, the soil got richer. You're going to make more money from your carbon coins because the carbon than you will from the actual food, which was a bounty for them. You talk about animal corridors that were established so animals could actually migrate, all the way from, northern Canada all the way down to Mexico, where all of these blockades, freeways and fences were actually taken down to allow that. Let's talk about some of those ideas, because those are based on reality. Carbon coin was a fellow named Chen who wrote a paper about it, and animal corridors people have been working on for many, many years to try to figure out how do you allow animals to move. As two examples, there's many others, but speak about your integration of those ideas, but then they're implemented in the book and how they actually turn out.
Sure. And I think you're right to focus on those as being two of the very most important. The Delton Chen paper about the carbon coin, the idea is this: everybody has to make a living, and you can't do the right things concerning your carbon burn and have to pay for it also beyond a certain limit, and then you won't. This is like resistance to a carbon tax, etc. There's an overriding consideration of taking care of yourself and your family, your children. That means that you can only afford to do a certain amount of virtuous action. And we also have a world where investment capital goes to the highest rate of return. And building a giant decarbonizing, like a sewer system that is worldwide, that has a biological and mechanical elements to suck down carbon dioxide, which nobody needs or wants. This is a cost. It's not the highest rate of return. You can just do a simple syllogism there and say, well, therefore we are doomed, because the economic system that we're in goes to the highest rate of return, which is an algorithm that is a little bit simplistic, a little bit of a Ponzi scheme, a little bit of a cheat to the future generations. But we're in it, and it's the law. So how do we escape this tight spot that we're in? Money needs to be paid for doing the good work rather than bad. Well, who can direct money? Payments like that. Governments can. You go back to World War II, you go back to the Depression, quantitative easing. We saw it in 2008, and at the start of the pandemic. The government, through its central bank, and the U.S. dollar is luckily the benchmark currency for the entire world. It's the ultimate anchor point for the entire world's currencies. It's the rock solid thing. You make more dollars, and sometimes it's been 5 trillion. Some people estimate 10 trillion. That's big, but we don't know anymore what effect that will have on the world economy to make up that much new money. It didn't seem to rock the boat very much in the last 2 times we did it. In this case, they call it carbon quantitative easing, and that means that in the first creation of the money by the central banks, they spend it on decarbonizing projects. People have to do that work. They're getting paid to decarbonize. Regenerative agriculture is great because you both grow food and you grow dirt, and that sucks some carbon into the soil. It's not the only solution. In fact, the solutions have to be so various. There's a wish list of solutions that have already been worked out that is hugely long. But it all needs to be paid for. When people talk about, well, it has to scale, that's code in the current lingo for it has to be paid for fast. It has to be outside or above and beyond the ordinary profit system. And so we need a kind of Keynesian governmental takeover of the direction of the economy. It's not like you nationalize everything. That would be impossible and probably crazy. It's a public-private partnership like Keynes has always been. So you do get away from the neoliberal 40 years of trusting the market to make smart decisions. It doesn't. You have to trust government to make the smart decisions and then manipulate and push and shove the market in the right direction so that the highest rate of return is actually doing the right thing because of taxes, regulations, and this carbon coin. So that was very exciting to me.
Let's just interrupt.
Yeah.
But you also talked about how basics are not for profit, that health, education, housing, clothing, food become a basic right. And
yes.
You also talk about people becoming planetary citizens and a job guarantee. I mean, these are big social frames that actually are triggered because we're trying to restructure capitalism because of climate.
Well, it's good you mentioned those. Those are all very important. This carbon quantitative easing ends up being a full employment program. All the worry about unemployment because of robotics is a red herring. In fact, there's more work to be done than there are people to do it. Everybody could get a job, and once you get full employment, then suddenly fear is taken out of the equation. You take the job that you're interested in doing because you know that you can get a job from the government doing something useful. So that is a derivative effect of making up that much new money, is that you can hire people like the Biden administration's Civilian Conservation Corps, the old CCC coming back. In those days, in the 30s, they had people building post offices and building trails in the national parks. Those are still there. They're great. But now we can build decarbonization machinery, and that is going to be also of permanent use to human civilization. So yes, a job guarantee and a kind of floor that means that once you've got a job, you don't have to get too universal basic income. You don't have to get too much universal basic services. Those are actually great concepts to explore. But what I mean is, if you have a job that covers your necessities and gives you a living wage, then you are an actor with agency, just like anybody else in that economy, doing something useful and meaningful and making a living. And this is sort of a floor that could be created by the carbon coin. Yes, Andrew, I'm so glad that you are following up these ramifications for me.
No, so let's talk about the other side of things. There's a, let's call it, they call the Children of Kali in the book, and they believe that, and it's interesting. There is, I think you gave me a follow-up book after we spoke to read how to blow up a pipeline. Yes, which I read, and it's not about how to blow a pipeline, by the way, for everyone. It is actually why one may need to, because you need to escalate to a certain point. Like, is it your moral obligation to stop destruction? And so the Children of Kali, I don't want to do too many spoiler alerts here, but it comes out of that first event in the book, in chapter 1. And there's a thing called Crash Day and the use of drones. And it's a real wake-up call, but it's people actually taking, very active measures, And I look, as I see the news, and I think, I mentioned this to you, things like the Colonial Pipeline being brought to its knees for weeks. There was the underground explosion in the Gulf of Mexico where there was literally fire under the water, lava.
Yeah.
There was the attacks by the Saudis on the Saudi oil platform by drones, which fit into that model of what the Children of Kali would do. I want to just talk a little bit about that action, how it came to be in the book, how it motivated change, and are we actually seeing it in the real world today?
Well, maybe so. And it's a good question that I'm uncomfortable talking about, being kind of a pacifist myself. But, however, Malm is very good on this. Andreas Malm, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I would say that you can read The Ministry for the Future better if you have read Malm's book, because he's a clearer diagnostic of this issue. And my book is kind of a mess, like history itself. I don't need to apologize for it. History's messy, the future's going to be messy. But Malm provides an analytical tool to kind of read Ministry for the Future better. And what he asks is, at what point do people, ordinary citizens, middle-class citizens in the developed world who are fairly well off, at what point is their moral obligation to go out and resist if the fossil fuel industries have somehow bought government, if representative government everywhere, democracies in the West, the Communist Party in China, these are all representatives of their people, but if the representatives are bought by the oil and fossil fuel industries and are wrecking the biosphere in a way that's going to destroy future humanity's chance and do a mass extinction event, at what point are you obliged to do something? And then he gets into this question of nonviolence versus violent resistance. And he points out that the great civil disobedience campaigns, Gandhi in India, the civil rights movement in the South during the 60s in the United States, that are famous for civil disobedience working, that's right. But it's not the whole story, because in each one of those cases, there was a radical wing that was willing to do violent things, and they were getting angrier and angrier when their more pacifistic allies on the cause were getting shut down by the people in authority that were doing bad things. And it was fear of the radical wing that made the authorities cooperate with the peaceful wing as being the better of bad options from their point of view. We better deal with Martin Luther King, or else we're going to be dealing with Malcolm X, and all the downtowns in America are going to burn down. So it was indeed heroic civil resistance, nonviolent, but also backed by the fear of angry people. Now, the heat wave in India that starts my novel is horrific, and wherever that touches down, the survivors are going to include some very angry people. They're not going to have any patience for middle-class pieties about how you don't get to hurt property or people. They are going to be radicalized. So we're kind of in a time-delayed version of that situation I described, where we could do the right things now in order not to confront the violence later on. In my novel, I described quite a bit of it, and believe me, it made me nervous and unhappy, but I thought it was not unrealistic. I thought it's if we don't cope, and in the novel, they don't really start coping till around 2030. I no longer think that's going to happen. I think the pandemic has speeded the timeline up, which is a good thing. But in any case, in my novel, because we didn't cope in time, there's some pretty bad stuff that happens through the middle of the book.
Yeah. Let's shift the conversation a little bit here and talk about climate refugees. The IIPC, the 6, but also the 5, the one that was done, I guess, in 2013, predicted 100 million climate refugees from droughts, from all kinds of reasons, but basically the shifting of humanity. And you can see it in sub-Saharan Africa. You can see that just certain areas of the planet are becoming uninhabitable, which is what the scientists said. And it's literally happening. There's, I don't know the exact number, but there are more people in refugee camps and on the move right now than post-World War II. Like, this is the highest number in history. Wow. And it is all could be traced back to something, basically lack of food and lack of water due to the shifting of climate. I mean, you look at like Haiti and what's going on the southern border of the United States right now. I mean, after earthquake and then after the hurricanes, people are trying to flee. And, talk about that. Talk about the impact on just this movement of large numbers of humanity in the book.
Sure. It's hard to. It's an intractable problem in that we're not great at coping with it. It's a humanitarian nightmare. 100 million is a lot. It's way larger than the population of England, and I think it's the equivalent of maybe Germany or France. In any case, 100 million, as you pointed out, the largest number of refugees in history already. And that many people are very hard to feed and house in emergency conditions in camps. I made them a strand in my novel because I thought we have to include these people. This is part of climate equity, that typically the most immiserated, the poorest people on the planet are the ones that are going to get hammered first by climate change. And the people who have burned the most carbon are going to be able to protect themselves from it to a certain extent. Eventually they'll get hit too. But the sharp end of the stick hits first on the poor. And then you're in a camp, and sometimes we see this in the Middle East because of political upheavals that are sometimes very much climate-inspired, bad climate, drought. People living their whole lives in camps and are semi-immiserated. Now, what's the solution? Well, in my novel, eventually they do something almost equivalent to open borders. It comes out of World War I. There were millions of refugees after World War I who had no passports, no papers, and they were wandering Europe and the rest of the world. So Fridtjof Nansen, the famous polar explorer, was put in charge of a UN committee, and he came up with what we call Manson Passports, so that these stateless refugees were given Nansen passports, or they were given paper. They had the right to live somewhere, and they were back in the system. And also, they weren't cooped up into cages or into camps. And they were allowed to move somewhere and start up a life. And typically they would move where people were speaking their language, either as an immigrant community or else back in their own countries. So that was a solution that is suggestive for what's going to come down in the 21st century. But by and large, and indeed there are some good books being written now about the incredible mobility of the younger people on this planet. Between the internet and the ubiquity of English as a first language or second language, you're beginning to have a global population of young people who are not tied to their home place and are willing to move around and are actually interested in moving around. Now, this is a different level. This is more like the precariat or the middle class who have some money and they say, look, I'm going to go teach English in Korea or in Shanghai, and I like it there, and then suddenly you become an expatriate. There are people writing good books. Parag, I can't remember Parag's last name. I think it's called Move, though. So the book is called Move, and it's stimulating to thought, to think that there may be humans coming in the generations to come who are more mobile around this planet, and that might be a good thing because it will loosen up this sense of nation-state rigidity that we're in now.
Yeah, that's a big transformation. Two other concepts I want to discuss, and then I'm going to leave some time for questions. One, you refer to the tragedy of the time horizon, which is really a great phrase, and really I think is really an important concept. And the other, you talk about the assumption that efficiencies are always good. I believe Javin's paradox you discuss in the book, that these increases in efficiency are going to lead to increases in demand, and how does that play out in kind of in the evolution?
Yeah. Sure. And what was the first part of that?
Oh, the tragedy of the time horizon.
Oh, got you. Yes. These are interesting new issues. Like, let's say that economics is struggling to understand the political economy of the world, that it's not a science like physics, and it's a social science in which neoliberal capitalism has revealed how ideological and how inadequate economics is for organizing human affairs right now. So, efficiency, that's seen as a virtue no matter what, and this is the kind of excessive rationality that leads to dreadful results, like machine guns are efficient, the gas chambers were efficient. These are efficiency as not the right rubric. And in economics, it's usually, mainstream classical economics is usually regarded as a good thing no matter what. So, I mean, Jevon's paradox is the least of the problems. It can be efficient. Well, in the pandemic, it was very efficient to have one factory on the other side of the world that was supplying you with something that was necessary. Those people working for a dime, and then the profit chain would get it to your country on diesel-burning container ships. And very efficient, but not robust, not resilient, and has no justice in it because it's relying on poor people elsewhere to do the work that allows you to have your iPhone for just however many $100s. So these problems in economics keep popping up and obtruding themselves. And one thing economics does also is the discount rate. So if all the future generations of humans, how many would there be? Well, depends on how long you think humanity will last, but you can create quite fantastically large numbers if you're optimistic. Certainly, trillions of human beings compared to us, the 8 billion that are alive right now. If you're comparing them as equals, the future always wins. So you put a discount rate into your calculation. It sometimes can be the higher the discount rate, the less you value the future generations, the lower the discount rate, which can go right to zero, the more you are valuing the interests of the future generation. So the tragedy of the time horizon is it's very hard to imagine all these future humans that are going to be as real as we are, and they're going to have their own hopes and dreams, their hungers, their difficulties. They're not here yet, but they're going to be here. And you have to postulate extinction or some kind of horrific post-apocalyptic scenario to erase them from the story. But by and large, if humanity succeeds, they're going to be here. They have their rights. They will have their rights. So do they have their rights now? So the tragedy of the time horizon is you establish too high of a discount rate. You ignore the people of the future. You say, well, they're going to be rich. They're going to be clever. They're going to be better than us. They'll cope with anything they're faced with. After a mass extinction event, that's simply not true. So we have to... the phrase comes from the tragedy of the commons, and the tragedy of the commons is kind of an invalidated concept that when there's a commons, everybody will take more than will sustain it. That's not actually true when people study commons. Commons are actually highly regulated spaces by way of norms rather than laws and armies. And the commons actually did pretty well until they got enclosed. So the tragedy of the commons was kind of a right-wing economic statement, a kind of a property is all statement about human nature. And so I've written about the comedy of the commons, that when there's a commons that everybody pitches in and makes it better. And so the tragedy of the time horizon is that the future too is a kind of a commons, and we attempts to enclose it by contracts, by mortgages. The way that ordinary capitalism tries to capture the future value and have it streaming up to capital and not to people. This is all part of the tragedy of the time horizon.
And actually working on, it was interesting, just today I was having a long conversation with someone about the idea of the commons right now, that when companies put carbon into the air, they are basically, they're externalizing the costs, and therefore they are taking from the commons. When they're dumping plastics into the ocean, they are externalizing their costs. And this is a fundamental, I think, the idea of the commons is one that needs to come back and needs to actually be examined, because I agree with you. It actually was successful until people, I guess it began with people wanting to be able to have their sheep be able to graze in common ground, or have a forest. You could take a certain amount of lumber to build a house, but if people take too much and raise the forest, you've got a problem. There's an imbalance, and that's so. It's how do you become back to that global citizen, where you're actually caring about the good of all.
Yeah, these are crucial questions. It's famous in the history of capitalism, the moment of enclosure, where property rights overcame the common rights of ordinary individuals, which were not quite encoded in law. And if they were, the laws were changed to privilege private property over the commons. Sometimes, as in the Scottish Highlands, this was almost genocidal. And it certainly wrecked the older way of life that was, you could call it feudal, but you could also call it just pre-capitalistic and some kind of moral economy that was different. Anyway, it is an interesting problem in history and in economic history, but now here we are, you can see the bad effects of almost a reductio ad absurdum. If property and profit are the only algorithms you use to make decisions, then you get disaster. And we're right trembling on the brink of disaster, and we have to claw our way back.
And you get the polarization of wealth, where you have, a tenth of 1% of people owning all of the wealth. But generally, when that's happened historically, then there is a revolution and there's a redistribution. I'm going to open it up for questions. If anyone would like to raise their hand, Namita will invite you up on stage, and you can have the conversation. Give everybody a minute or two to raise their hands if they want to come up. If not, I will continue, because I've got a long list of other things to talk about, as well as going back to some of the things that we just sort of touched on.
Andy,
well, someone's.
I'm not host, so I can't see who's raising their hands.
Oh, who is host?
You are. So either you can.
Oh, I see. Oh, wait,
yeah.
There we go. I see. Okay, wave at Patricia. Let me see. I'm waving at Patricia.
Let's see, Patricia. Well, you working on that. Let me.
I think we just lost Andy.
Oh dear. Well, let me talk to everybody else whilst he hopefully gets back on. Namita, you can work on that, because Andrew brought up something so interesting here, which is, okay, if you've got massive inequality and wealth concentrated in the 1%, let's call it, sometimes you could say 10%, sometimes you could say 1/10 of 1%, concentrated wealth at the top. And he said typically that results in a revolution and a redistribution. What's interesting now, it's being conceptualized, is could you get the benefits of a revolution without the violence and chaos of the revolutions that happened historically? And how would that happen? A kind of a jujitsu, a kind of an application of legislation, redistributive legislation like progressive taxation, et cetera, et cetera. None of it is particularly complicated theoretically. And the application of a kind of revolutionary redistribution by way of legislation would be like the best way to do it. So it's interesting to contemplate that.
So I think, Jimmy, are you able to unmute? I invited you to speak. I know when I clicked on Patricia, we went out into another room, so I didn't do that right. Jimmy, can you speak? I thought I invited you. Yeah, invite to speak. I'm not very skilled at this.
And if you click on my photo, it shouldn't let you make me host, and then I can take control of that.
There you go. Okay, you're now a moderator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Namita. Yes, I'm trying to get Jimmy unmuting Jimmy, but
yeah. So I've sent him an invite, and he should be able to join us when he can.
Okay.
We have Martin, who has a question, so I'm going to let him on stage.
Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon. My understanding is that I haven't read the whole book, so in the book, it becomes self-evident that this is the major solution for helping to refocus our priority for sustainability and sequester the various forms of carbon. And we need to do that sooner. And when you ask some central bankers, what can you do? They are saying, well, that's not in our mandate, and we're under the folks that chartered us, as if they're just a third-party international agency. So, do you see a pathway for us to encourage this adoption of this method, along with others in parallel, to get to the end sooner and start the momentum in the right direction? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. And it's interesting because since I finished Ministry for the Future, I have learned more, and I'm more hopeful than I was before. My Mary Murphy, the Minister for the Future of the title, has to batter central bankers for the better part of a decade to badger them into doing these carbon coin type things. In the real world, the central banks got together in 2017 after, in 2015, Mark Carney, head of the Bank of England, suggested that they needed to gather as central banks. They formed a network for greening the financial system. You can go to their website. It's 89 of the biggest world central banks in the world, and they have put out white papers that describe things that are like the carbon coin. Essentially, these are the things that we can do with monetary policy to green the financial system fast. And whether my carbon coin in my book is a symbol for those, or whether the carbon coin would be a 10th thing to their 9 suggestions, I don't have the expertise to unpack that. But what I'll say is that it's super encouraging that central bankers are looking for ways they can help. And then what they're all saying is, we have to stay in our lane. We have our mandate. It's monetary policy only. We have to deal with stabilizing the value of money itself and maybe helping with employment. That's their only 2 mandates. So you need people to push their representatives, and you need the representatives to legislate demands on the central banks to make this stuff happen. And what's interesting is the central banks will then say, oh yes, well, we have these instruments already figured out. And the legislators can then specifically ask for one tool rather than another, and it won't have to be invented after the fact of the legislation. So I find this encouraging. And what it says to me is that the solutions here are getting to be really obvious. We've got to pay ourselves to do the right things rather than the wrong things. And otherwise, we've got catastrophe beyond what humanity can handle. And that's, bankers are not immune from that. In my book, I have Mary Murphy saying to the bankers, look, if you want to keep money stable, you actually have to save civilization. Because when civilization crashes, money doesn't mean anything anymore, and you've failed in your mandate as well as everybody else failing. And that catches their attention. I think that's already happened. And it's very encouraging, because in my book, I had it happening in like the year 2040 after huge super depressions, etc. Now I think there's a sense of urgency in the air, and it's probably pandemic inspired. So we'll see, but I'm encouraged compared to when I wrote the book.
Great, thanks. Is there another? I see Patricia's on stage now. Great.
Great, thanks. Thanks. I love the book, and I love the fact that you had so many different perspectives. I work more on the human rights issues. You mentioned, the people on the boats, especially around forced labor, mining, as well as all the climate, et cetera. So I'm sure it was difficult to pick and choose what you were going to put in there and intertwine it all. So I think you did that masterfully. But then in regards to Plan B and how, there are a lot of different organizations trying to do things differently, having to do with everything from racial justice and inequality and migrants and climate, et cetera, et cetera. How do we make sure everybody's, interconnected so that as other systems fall apart, we are there, but working together to build them back up again?
Well, it's awkward as hell. You put your finger on an outstanding problem in that the nation-state system and capitalism, so the political system and the economic system that we live under, the political economy, because they're really tied together, is a really bad tool for the crisis that we're facing, which is global and biospheric, and everybody's involved. So I've seen encouraging things since I wrote my book. I remind you, I wrote it in 2019. That's like a previous geological era at this point. Trump was still president, and he might have won. The pandemic had not happened, and I was worried that we would not be alarmed as we should be. So when I wrote the book, I was in a different state of mind. And what have happened since is that because of the existence of the book, I've been asked to talk to everybody. And in a way, this is a category error. I am a novelist. I don't have original ideas. I kind of orchestrate and choreograph other people's ideas and things that I read, like everybody reads in the news, and try to make a story out of it. That's all very well, but when then people ask me for, well, then what should we do? I have to revert back to the book. The book is what I know. The novel is like more than I know. I marshal my forces, write a scene, and it's like taking a final as a college student. I then promptly forget about half of it, and then I have to forge onward. But what I'm seeing in the people that I'm talking to is, for instance, to get to your question, the UN has set up an agency that is now looking 50 years ahead instead of 5 and 10. And that agency is trying to rate all the good plans and say which ones are shovel ready, which ones are ripe for development and could be usefully supported by investment capital from private industry. And so there's some, and of course the UN is only one node in a big network, but it is international, and it shows that, again, experts see the nature of the problem, and these experts with their expertise are saying, well, let's try to sort it out using the social sciences, using the humanities, and using NGOs, and using all humans to make a kind of menu and a priority list. So I've seen that too, and indeed I'm on that committee in a way. It's like a gesture people make, like the art should be included here, but which artist is aware of all these issues? And I'm filling an empty ecological niche in the cultural scene, which I'm happy to do. But I would presume that there would be more artists, more younger people beginning to try to tell these stories.
Great, thank you. So I think next up is Peter. You can unmute.
Yeah. Hi, Pete Leiden here. Kim, terrific book. I've recommended it to a ton of folks, and frankly, I've read most of your books for the last 20 years here, and you fill a great niche of making people think more systematically and accurately about the coming years and decades, and if not centuries. So thank you. Andrew, you did a great job roughing out all the pieces, but one of the pieces that you didn't touch on, which I'd be interested in, is the book really opened up my thinking about the need for geoengineering in a way that I've been resisting and been really cautious about going down that path. And yet it does play a pretty interesting role in there. And I'm just curious, Kim, if you could basically elaborate a little bit on where you're coming down on that and how you think about it and how we should think about it now.
Yeah, thank you for that, Peter, because it is important. I'm going to say that we might be in an all-hands-on-deck situation where if we start hitting these wet bulb 35 temperatures, it might make sense to throw dust into the atmosphere and deflect some sunlight and drop temperatures for 5 years or so and see what happens. See if it wrecks the monsoon. See if it keeps people from dying. And I can see that as an emergency gesture that we therefore ought to put on the table for discussion. It's a dangerous one. Another one that I think is uncontroversial is we should draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. If you call that geoengineering, it's almost like, I don't know, reversing cars or a giant sewage system. Are sewer systems geoengineering? It begins to point out how weird the name is and how many disparate things it covers. Direct air capture, there doesn't seem to be a downside. It wouldn't threaten the monsoon. We could maybe ratchet back down to 400 or even 380 parts per million. We would have an awful lot of dry ice sitting around that we would have to inject underground or somehow dispose of. If it became building materials by way of materials science, that would be great, but it wouldn't be gigatons needed for that. So this disposal problem is now being discussed under the geoengineering rubric. The last one that I feature in my novel quite extensively because it made me laugh and it made me happy was sucking water out from under the big glaciers to slow them back down. This is in Antarctica and Greenland. Some glaciologists proposed the idea to me and I ran with it. I thought it was individual glaciologists and they're very imaginative, spacey scientists. I mean, they really love their ice, and I didn't know whether it was realistic or not. But after I wrote the book, someone pointed out that there's a paper, 2017 or 2018, in Nature magazine, which is really the gold standard, as you know, about this very process, running the numbers on it, quantities, and pointing out that the oil industry already has the technology to do it. And what that does is save sea level, so that 200 years from now, we aren't looking at a drowned New York, a drowned London, all the great seacoast cities, which is a quarter of humanity, are going to be struggling with rising sea levels, and all the beaches will be gone. So if we could slow down the glaciers, and it was relatively inexpensive on the large scheme of things, which means what, $50 billion and a massive effort, but we've got the industry to do it, is that also geoengineering? And wouldn't that be a great thing with no downside? So this is what I would say now, that geoengineering is a bad term, because what it means in the popular culture is doing dangerous silver bullet things to try to get away with capitalism and keep on burning carbon. That's what it means. That's its definition. So when you say geoengineering, everybody, and especially American leftists like myself, that crowd shudders and said, "Oh my gosh, more just pouring gas on a fire." I think geoengineering has to be decommissioned as a word, and each one of these processes examined on its own merits with the idea we might be in an emergency, and nothing should be taken off the table. Not in a knee-jerk way, anyway. And I'll end with this: women's rights is geoengineering. Because when women have robust rights across this globe, the population rate drops to below replacement rate, and then we get a mild and uncoerced, and it's a matter of human rights lowering the human population, which would in its own way help the stress that we're putting on the biosphere. So when you say, oh, well, women's rights is geoengineering, at that point you've thoroughly blown up the term, and you can put it on the shelf and begin to think about these potential actions one by one.
Yeah, I believe Paul Hawken in Drawdown has women's rights as being, it's not number one, it's certainly in the top 5 as having an impact on climate. And it is interesting because, I also have that same reaction that Peter has, which is, what could go wrong? They're going to cover the ice cap with reflective beads, right?
Yeah,
what could go wrong? They're going to shoot whatever nitrogen or whatever sulfur into the atmosphere. I have the same. They're going to dump, iron filings into the oceans to.
Well, that one, these are, let's follow that a little. The iron filings in the ocean the oceans are so stressed out already that the iron filings in the ocean has sort of been discredited as we don't know what's going to happen, and let's not stress that poor system anymore. The throwing, like dust into the atmosphere, volcanoes do sulfur dioxide, which wrecks the ozone layer. And so people are now saying it should be calcium carbonate, it should be limestone dust, which is up there already and which is neutral chemically. And so the solar radiation management, as it's called, of throwing dust up in the atmosphere and imitating a volcano, that's already been elaborated, and it still freaks people out because it looks Promethean and sure to backfire, blah, blah. But we know from Pinatubo that it would lower temperatures, and if it wasn't sulfur dioxide, that'd be great, for about 5 years, and then it lands on the ground. Now, even that dust on the ground, if it's on the ice of the Arctic, that might increase the melting of the ice in the Arctic. So yes, secondary effects are not to be scoffed at, but in an emergency, individual actors or nation states might go ahead and try it anyway. The more we know, the better off we might be.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. Let's see, other questions? Maybe the people who are already on stage, they could go. Just have a couple of minutes.
No more raised hands.
Okay. So let's see. So Stan, what are you working on now? What's your next project? And also how is Ministry for the Future, when it came out, you were telling me the other day that actually the sales are increasing, that it's basically just like it's building from word of mouth. So how's the book doing? Is there a movie in the works? Will this be the as China syndrome was to nukes, will Ministry of the Future's movie be to climate? Talk about that a little.
Sure, and it's been a pleasure to watch, I have to say, because I have had books in the last decade and throughout my whole career that go out there and drop like a stone in a pond. So I don't take this for granted. Ministry for the Future, it came out almost exactly a year ago. I think it was October 4th of last year. And in that year, it has changed my career, but also it's not a bestseller in the sense of New York Times #1 bestseller in terms of millions of copies that come and then go. It will be more like what Thomas Hardy called a long seller. And it's also a question of who's reading it. People interested in policy and interested in the future are reading it because there's not much like it. So the invitations to speak, as I say, have been numerous and fascinating. And the book is selling better now than on its opening, which is not quite anti-gravity. My Mars books are selling better now than when they came out. Now that's anti-gravity in publishing terms. Ministry has just taken a while to catch people's attention, but word of mouth has been superb. There is a major TV studio that has optioned it and is working on a script, and I basically am a writer, I think. And I've looked at 25 years of optionings of my books for potential film or TV. It must be hard. My books are strange and unwieldy. This one probably has better chance than most, but I still wouldn't hold my breath.
Okay.
So Andy, Andrea just joined the stage.
Okay, Andrea, you'd like a last question? Go for it.
Very much. I have not read the book, and I'm really looking forward to. I'm literally walking out the door to get it now, doing some other errands. So thank you for this talk. Dr. Michael Dorsey recommended this talk to me today. I'm very glad he did. I wanted to just ask, in your thinking around this, and this is for any of the three of you, kind of how you've imagined the role of youth. We've been in several rooms here in Clubhouse where we've been talking about the need to equip youth to deal with this future that's heading their way, and also a sense that we are not incorporating their views, their ideas, their out-of-the-box thinking. They're kind of, they're thinking about, well, if we need this, then why don't we just make it so, versus we can't do it because things work like this, and we can't do that. So they're fresh thinking, and also their inheritance, which is, our future and the planet. And so I know that, for example, I'm affiliated with the Nobel Peace Laureate, Kailash Satyarthi, who won the prize in 2004, co-awarded with Malala. And he and a number of Nobel laureates are calling on all world leaders to not just, think about climate, but to ensure there are global social protection floors in place for the very vulnerable folks that are going to be on the brunt of these crises, who are already impacted right now from poverty, et cetera. And I just wondered what your views were on those two topics. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it must be scary as hell to be young today, and I'm not young. I'm trying to imagine it. I'm very often talking to college classes, so they are almost precisely 50 years, half century younger than me. It's like they're my grandchildren age, if I had been faster to have kids myself. But in any case, how scary, because it's not going to go away. It's the whole rest of their lives. So when I talk to them, I try to frame it as a project, that it's important to have meaning in your life. And the climate crisis means that you've got meaning in your life shoved right into your face. It's not going to be a question of, well, what do I do? And, make money and then die. Nothing matters. It's actually a kind of a saving the world project that everybody will be cast into together. And so, although it isn't a good situation, it's not a bad time to be young if you want to have meaning in your life. The meaning has been shoved in their face and they can't avoid it. Some of them will try to avoid it, go into escapist, go into the internet, go into various kinds of escape modes. But a lot of them will engage and say, well, okay, if this is the case, then what can I do? And then their education and their job history will reflect some kind of green work, and that generation will be the one that lives through the transition. And it's great. This show, as you sow, so you shall reap. So the young are powerless relatively in a financial sense. And it goes right down to children. I'm fighting to keep a preschool alive here in Village Homes, California, which is a fight I should not have to fight because people my age are suddenly unaware of the importance of a preschool, which boggles my mind. We have to represent the powerless young and the future generations that we also need to represent. Some of them are already here. It's just that they're very young. So I expect to see, mass action and more awareness, and I expect it to be a mixed picture with a lot of despair and giving upness and a feeling that we're already doomed in advance, even though we didn't make the crisis. They're going to be all over the map, but social movements happen. I know this because of my own moment of anti-Vietnam and civil rights. They happen as a wave action, where once you see the wave happening and you can join it, then you don't have to be individually virtuous. You just do what everybody else in your generation is doing. And I presume that they're going to be doing a lot because it'll be on them. And to the extent that we can help them, leverage them, and like you pointed out in the second part of your question, basically moving capital to the people who need it most, that's a big ask in the way the modern world works, because capital usually accumulates and people who have it want to keep it. Shifting capital out probably needs government action, and as I referred to earlier. So it is an all-hands-on-deck situation, and the young are going to be living it their whole lives, just like we're never going to get out of it. It's just the condition. It's the name for this moment of history. The 21st century is going to be the century of coping with biosphere destruction and climate change and getting in balance with our one and only biosphere. That's the name for this century.
And maybe we need a Ministry of Truth as part of a subdivision of your Ministry of the Future to combat all the disinformation.
Well, Orwell is. But hey, that's not a name you can use. But let me address what you're talking about here. Truth. Let's talk about science. As what science intends to say to the world is, if you would look at my experiment and go through all of the explanations for my experiment and watch it with me, you would come to the same conclusion I have here. And that's the inexorable power of science, is reproducibility and looking at the evidence and concluding that the scientist that has found a law or a rule or a phenomenon has found something that you agree with. So I'm going to say that when you say truth, what we really need to say is science. Base things on the science, because that's how we coordinate our what we agree on to be true, is by way of science.
The idea of veracity. It's something that, as you saw, we deal with a lot. Actually, right now, we're asking a lot of companies about the disclosures that they make. We filed a resolution at both Exxon and Chevron last year about what was called auditing, and people thought it was maybe a little dry, but it's a really fascinating idea that anything that is material is financial, and anything that's financial must be in the audited statement. So if the companies actually were to put in the audited statement anything that's material, meaning greenhouse gas disclosures, diversity, equity, inclusion, racial justice, all this information, that you'd actually have a data set that has veracity, and it would change the perception. It would allow ESG scores to be real and start to agree. And I think that there's a lot of misleading information right now. This whole transition into ESG, we're doing a lot of analysis and actually talking to both the SEC and the Department of Labor about the mislabeling of mutual funds that have ESG in their name. We just did an analysis of 3,000 funds, 88 have ESG in their name, and 51 of them, more than half, get a D or an F on the As You Sow scoring for environmental, social, and governance. So words need to have meaning, and we need defined glossaries that are enforced. So that's what's the enforcement is really the critical part.
I like that very much. I'm hard on economist, but I'm really hard on political economy that is simply neoliberal capitalism. Well, I do love the idea of quantification. Once you've measured it and quantified it, then you can say this is real and we need to do something about it. So, and making these rubrics and standards is crucial going forward. So I think that you're onto a super important work there.
So it's a little bit after 1. I think.
I had one thing to add.
Oh, please.
Yeah, this is Martin here. I just wanted, as you talk to other audiences and you speak with the committee that looks at its applications and its implications, and the central banks as well, that in the past we've been looking at this as, it'll only cost this much because it's sort of like an insurance policy. But the social equity stack turns out to be pretty much the only way to get to an exponential benefit. In other words, decentralized transfers of technology, perhaps on a collective equitable blockchain that is used for the purpose of helping the ecosystems and humanity. Because when we are able to give the resources to Africa and India and others in the soil sequestration and in diversified integrated manufacturing at a local level, possibly, as you say, using material sciences to take CO2 and turn it into other materials, copper and steel that's 1/10 the weight and so on. Those to bring those things to scale, but not in the way that was done through the neoliberal system in the past, with only debts and major players. You want that sort of exponentiality of everyone's potential working together in the best way they can at the locations they can. Saving our traditional ways and the heritage of all the diverse languages and medicinal possibilities and range of soils and all of our great heritage together. And we see that where 80% of the remaining species on the world are kept by the original people who managed them so well for thousands of years. That wisdom, along with modern research and open data sources, those kinds of things. And then even from the insurance standpoint, you look at 30-year notes that are being bought, and bonds and securities and equities. Those are, if we say to those folks, hey, how about we take 5 years back on the end, or 10 years back on the end, and we swap that for the new green tech, and we really move those from the drawing board and past, get it out there to where it needs to be at the scale it needs to be, and that kind of thing. I just want to, saving original cultures and languages, focusing on soil and habitat restoration now. We can skip over, like the Chinese did with the telecoms. We didn't have to run wires to everyone's house. We can skip over the drilling and wrecking any more forests for heavy, dirty carbon minerals or even metals in our green transition. So I just hope we can really put our arms around humanity. And I think you were right about the nation state is not quite fit for purpose, but we have to provide the viscosity so that we can cooperate across borders more, perhaps, and lift each other up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would agree with all that and say that the nation-state system is what we have, but it is fluid at the borders. And also, the nation-states that are first to take up all these green technologies and to push them will, even in the old rubric of competitive advantage, will have the advantage in the new economy because they've gotten there first with it. So for those nation states or actors in those nation states that are thinking old school of a zero-sum game and you got to protect your country against all the others, even that group should be looking to the idea that the first green businesses, the first green countries are going to have that competitive advantage, and their own populations are going to benefit from it. So I'm hoping that this is an argument made. I think it's a good argument. I'm hoping it'll be made in Glasgow. I'm off to COP26 to be the the cardboard representative of the Minister for the Future is precisely because of my book. And I'll be speaking there, but mostly watching and hoping, like everybody else. It will be interesting as can be, and I don't know if it'll stimulate further stories for me. I feel kind of done. On the other hand, an experience like that will certainly give me ideas, and I'm thinking also about the Arctic. So maybe I'm not done yet. I was kind of hoping I was, but the stories keep happening, and of course I need to write, so something's got to happen. That's my own personal angle on it, is to just keep telling the stories.
Namita, may I just make one clarifying comment very quickly, which is when I was joking about the Ministry of Truth and talking about disinformation, I think I meant more than just science. Just to clarify, I think, if you read Michael Mann's book, he talks about that it's important to know how some of the disinformation campaigns are used from certain industries to greenwash or to make it seem that issues are not as great as they are, less urgency, and also of course things that happen around the campaign. And I apologize for the background.
Yeah, it's a wicked political battle. Let's just admit that there are people who are not going to be convinced by this worldview, this analysis of the world situation. They will, for whatever reason, and they have to examine their own consciences as to what those reasons are. They're going to be fighting this process tooth and nail, and they've got quite a bit of resources, especially in terms of money, to fight it. I think they are intransigent. I think that we are going to have to steamroll them by a political working majority that is either 51% or 55% or 60% in certain weird circumstances, and just try to get the job done with the knowledge that there's going to be people kicking and screaming the whole way, which is unfortunate but true. Uh-oh. Okay.
We might have...
No, I'm muted. Okay. Well, listen, thank you. Stan, it's been an honor and a privilege, and thank you for your work. And please keep it up. And just, these are really big ideas that need to be discussed and need to be figured out before we have a Kali event. And
yeah. Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everybody, for checking in. I really appreciate it, and I will say again, my book is my best foot forward. I hope that it is entertaining as well as instructive. A lot of you will know everything in it already, so it becomes a matter of, is it still entertaining at the level of the characters? And it's a beautiful portrait of Zurich, if I do say so myself, and Zurich is not widely celebrated in world literature, so even for that, I'm fond of the book. So I'll hope to meet you all somewhere.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.